All right, here we go. We're back again, Brigadoon Radio, where we talk to subject matter experts about emerging issues shaping commerce and culture. Joining us as always, our good friend Gerald Ashley. Gerald, how you doing?
I'm well. I'm back from a trip to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, but more on that a little bit later.
Yeah, I'm quite jealous. I love the Highlands, so I'm keen to hear more about that. And joining us today, we've got a special guest, David Buik. David, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
Mark, great pleasure. Gerald, greetings to you. I can't say that I've had such a lovely 3 days as you've had. I've sort of got the 1945 tin hat out of the cupboard, really, to try and save myself from the vagaries and ravages of Wall Street.
Well, that's great. I love it. David, give us a little background about your background for our worldwide audience. We have at least 17 followers in Rome. So if you want to share some of your expertise, and where are we finding you today?
I'm the impoverished son of a former chief executive of named Civic Steamships. And I ruined my father's money by not passing a single exam at a place called Harrow School, which Gerald would have heard of. My father took me to lunch at Gow's one day. I didn't know whether it was the steam from brown Windsor soup or whether he was crying as a result of these desperate exam results. And he said, you know what? He said, I had aspirations for you being a corporate lawyer, but unfortunately, you're going to now have to settle with working in a merchant bank, which today, of course, is laughable because it wouldn't have crossed the threshold. Anyway, cut a long story short, I was useless at that. And I became a money broker for about 50 years. And I'm in sort of semi-retirement. I am so in love with the City of London and with people like Gerald who've kept it going over the years that I've still maintained all this enthusiasm for life and for financial markets.
Well, that's fantastic. And I don't want to hijack the conversation, but you were born in one of my favorite countries, Canada. And will you be coming back to Canada, do you think?
Not to live, no. I mean, I have two sisters. One lives in Niagara Falls and the other one lives just outside of Washington. And they've been there for 60 years and they're reconverted with their own people. I think Canada is the most wonderful country to visit. I am more English than the English, and I have to admit it. And I love the sense of humor here, and I love the people. And I just think the sort of very strange and very peculiarly British sense of humor and style of life suits me. And much as I love my visits, which are, I have to say, rare, this country for me is top of the pops.
That is fantastic. I love it. More English than the English. Gerald, do you have anything to say about that?
No, not really. Other than to say that David does hide his Canadian roots quite well, because I think most people who meet him would think he is very English, which of course he is. I don't think we're going to talk a great deal about Britain and England and all the rest of it today, are we, Mark? What's on the menu?
No, we're not. We're actually going to go to another great island on the other side of the world. We're going to talk about Japan first and what's happening in the Asian and Pacific. I just noticed that your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, met with the Japanese Prime Minister yesterday, which was quite interesting. And also my president, Joe Biden, is off to Japan and South Korea at the end of the month. So I think we've been focusing a lot on Europe, obviously, but I think in the next few weeks, we're going to see a lot of Asia Pacific activity.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Japan is not in the headlines, but we like to think here that we sometimes get the jump on headlines. And I think it's going to be a big story through this year because it's our favorite word, the S word, which is, of course, security. And they've got two really big problems. One is their sort of geopolitical military security. They've obviously got China on their doorstep, and they've got the rocket man in North Korea to contend with as well. And David, you'll remember this, sort of harking back to the 70s when people pointed to Japan and said that they were in a terrible mess because they pretty much imported all their energy. And the statistics I've been looking at this week suggest that's still the same. Something like 99% of coal, gas, and oil all are imported into Japan. And on past experience and where the markets are these days, that's a serious problem. So there's a nice curved ball for you, David. What do you do if you're running Japan?
They are tremendous isolationists. It's a wonderful country to live. And they are more conservative than any conservative nation in the world. In fact, before any board decision was made, they'd ask the bloke who cleaned the latrines in the morning up to the chairman, or whether an action should be taken on any specific issue. And I don't think the culture of that has changed very much. I think what you pointed out over energy, Gerald, is absolutely spot on. It was very depressing, I think, when Fukushima went up in flames, in so many words, which of course is their nuclear power station 11 years ago, because I think that was the start of possibly an expansion of that area of power. But I think because of what happened, they are being very conservative about going back into that market. But Gerald, they're going to have to put it back on the menu, because they are so reliant, as you pointed out in your paper, of getting stuff, out of the Gulf and the Middle East and getting it through various canals. And if that, by any chance, whether it's Hormuz or whether it's Malaga, the other one, they've got a problem. And that's not a problem.
It kind of shows maybe the old cliche that the world is very small is very true now. Mark, you mentioned about Boris meeting the Japanese Prime Minister. This is, again, all part of another sort of grouping in geopolitics. I think it's called the Quad, which is the UK, the US, India, and Japan. And this is all about another sort of grouping to sort of keep an eye on China, I guess. Where does Mr. Biden's views sit on this, do you think?
Well, I want to correct you. First off, this is a classic example of UK overexpansion. The Quad actually involves Australia and not the United Kingdom. But you're right.
I can't believe it doesn't include us as well.
Well, not yet. But no, I think it's interesting that obviously this meeting happened. Maybe it's very important. I mean, obviously the UK has a huge presence in there, and maybe the UK will join the Quad, which I think is key. We'll see what comes out of this meeting. I think the 2 points you guys made I think about Japan, I think about isolation and imports, right? Both the need to import energy, but also the imports in this country here in the United States. And back in my high school years, we actually housed a foreign exchange student from Japan. His parents wanted him to become more American, so he shacked up with us for a year. And I have to say, I haven't talked to that family since. What's really interesting about the Japanese, and I think about their presence here in the U.S., Honda, Toyota, Sony, they're a cultural powerhouse. But for some reason, they're almost like punching below their weight. Like they haven't, and maybe it's their natural instincts not to be expansionist or their history of being conservative. But I think they really need to flip the script here. And maybe these kind of visits, the prime minister traveling, getting out and about, will help the Japanese. But they seem to be in a dire situation. They've got problems with the economy, with their expansion, the demographics. Every North Korean missile somehow seems to fly over Japan. And you have China. So I don't know, maybe this will be a rebirth and a resetting of Japan.
This is why I think it is going to be an emerging story. David has very cunningly hidden the fact that he spent time working in Japan. And did that change your view on them at all, David?
No, I'm afraid you've crystallized exactly what the views that I got. There's no question of any doubt about it. Two things that you and Mark haven't mentioned, but I know you would agree with me, is what makes me tingle on the back of my neck is the size of their debt, which is astronomical. But the conservative approach of everything in life, I mean, they have 3 people doing a job that 1 person would do in the United States and 1.5 people would do in Europe. And that isn't changed. For instance, if there's a hole in the ground, there's a guy with white gloves asking you, please not fall in the hole as you walk round it. And he's been doing that for 35 years, and it's unlikely to change. You think I'm being joking, but I'm actually quite serious. I'd like to just throw a pebble in the pond, if I may, because where Mark expressed about the 4 countries and the rest of it, I have extreme concerns about India, because I think India is deeply and irrevocably in love and also committed to Russia. They are inseparable. And I was talking to some very senior Chinese people last week who are from Beijing and are, from the wealthy brigade. And they just say it's convenient for China to be friendly with Russia, but they aren't really friends. And he said, boy, the real friendship is really between Russia and India to stave off China. And my worry is that there we have this thing that Gerald knows, Mark, and I'll stop talking in a minute, that I have extreme concern about sanctions. They are not working because everybody conveniently finds an excuse why they don't want to do it. And it's probably a very practical and reasonable excuse. And every day we stop putting sanctions in on Russia, the stronger they become. I mean, look at the ruble now, stronger than it was a year ago. I mean, this is just ludicrous. And I just think, and I hope that President Biden, and I hope Prime Minister Johnson, and I hope the Japanese Prime Minister look at the situation, as regards who is friends and who is genuine in the next 2 years, because I think it's going to be absolutely key.
This has got a bit of a 19th century feel to it, hasn't it? With the great game and the British Empire versus the Russian Empire and the desire to have water ports and all the rest of it. It's been a theme on our podcast, hasn't it, Mark? That in a way, the big, long historic narratives never quite go away. And you make an interesting point, David, about India, because I think the British assumption is, well, they're always on our side. Though, if we look to the days of Mrs. Gandhi, she was particularly close to what was the Soviet Union, and this whole idea of not being in the being a sort of separate group away from the West or the United States. So I don't know. I think maybe we assume India, when push comes to shove, will be on our side, whatever that may be. But perhaps that's an heroic assumption.
Well, I do think India, I don't know if you guys saw, just this week, Modi was in Paris with your buddy Macron, and apparently the French and the Indians created some they're selling military gear. The French will be selling military gear to the Indians. In the same week, India continues to buy low-price petrol and oil products from Russia. There's a huge desire, obviously here in the U.S., there's a huge constituency of Indian Americans. There's a huge desire for the United States to get India involved in any possible way to commit to some kind of global standard. I think India is quite the interesting country. It's almost a nation. It's almost beyond itself, if that makes sense. I mean, it really seems to rotate independently of everybody. And maybe they are the closest to Russia, but I think on any given day, they seem to go wherever they need to go.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Mark. If I could just interject here. If the rest of the world could provide India with what they get from Russia and do it in a manner whereby they can't necessarily do it on price, but they can increase it on trade, the level of trade and the amount of trade, and, if I may say so, the political goodwill, then in my opinion, the show's back on the road. But my real concern is that relationship, as I understand it, between Russia and India is stronger than we should feel comfortable with.
Well, getting back to Japan, I mean, is the model, like Japan is obviously all in on the West, right? I mean, US, UK, India seems to be playing everybody. Is that the model going forward? Is it better to be playing everybody, being friends with everybody, or, taking off our obviously Western hats? Do you admire what India is doing, or would you rather be in Japan's situation?
I think it's, what to say here? I think India has fewer challenges than Japan. I mean, you mentioned demographics earlier, Mark. The demographics of India are extremely good. They're poor in China. This is one of those sort of quiz questions that always trip people up, that we are going to see a declining population in China in the next 50 or 60 years, and that is baked in. We know the issue with demographics in Japan. I think India is much better placed in one way. One thing we shouldn't forget, and this may be a mystery that all three of us won't be able to solve, is that for all the bureaucracy and conservatism in Japan, it is still a highly inventive economy. And it does actually, it is a high-tech economy, and it does produce large amounts of innovation. Whether that will be enough to keep them on the road, it did work after the 70s and the 80s and 90s. This time, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm a huge opponent of soft power and kind of cultural power. And if I just think about media diets or cultural impact, Bollywood is a force, but I think there's a lot more Japanese fashion, entertainment consumed in the West than I would say India. And I think that's a Japanese superpower. And even Japanese cuisine versus Indian cuisine. I mean, we could maybe that may be a draw, but the Japanese soft power, I don't think should be dismissed either. Just the cultural impact.
Not at all. I mean, if I could just interject here, one of the dimensions, which I think is one of the things worth listening about, is that Japan has got 125 million people. They're all on the south and the east coast, and 85% of Japan is uninhabited. And the average size of dwelling in Japan is very small. Therefore, the demand for what they need for consumer goods is very limited. How many TVs can you have in a 2-room flat? How many electrical pieces of equipment can? The answer is very limited. That's why their relationship with the outside world, in terms, as you said, Gerald, quite rightly, and endorsed by Marc, of innovative thinking and innovative ideas and innovative equipment, is incredibly important to them. In fact, it should be much more important than it currently is. And if it were that much more successful because there was a greater driving force to try and do business with the outside world rather than, accept what they've done as sufficient, I think this problem that they've got would, I won't say go away, but it would diminish, because at the moment, you just get the impression that Japan is quite happy to be isolationist, quite happy to pay the bills and do the rest of it. But they have actually got tremendous opportunities. But their opportunities to actually expand in their own country on a domestic basis is extremely limited.
Two other thoughts on Japan. People who like looking at maps may want to take a look at the Kuril Islands. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. These are the disputed islands from, really, it goes all the way back to the Yalta Agreement at the end or towards the end of the Second World War. Basically, Russia has occupied some islands that the Japanese believed to be theirs and were before that date. That's unresolved, and quelle surprise, Mr. Putin has decided to stir that up a little bit. And that, again, is another worry to add to the list. And I think an important thing, which I don't think has got a lot of coverage in the Western press, is the rearmament of Japan. Japan is actually massively increasing defense spending. There was a culture, indeed, I think, after the Second World War and MacArthur's initial sort of constitutional ideas, there pretty much was nothing except a Japanese defense force. It was a very, very minor thing. No significant Japanese army and certainly no significant Japanese navy. Well, watch out, because I think the Japanese Navy is going to be one of the fastest growing ones in the next 5 to 10 years. And China is noticing this, and it's another factor in the modern world.
Yeah, and I note the North Koreans, Rocket Man, they've had 14 missile launches or tests this year, which is quite unnerving, obviously, in Tokyo. Speaking of maps, there's a great book. I don't know if you gentlemen have read this. It's called Monsoon. It's by Robert Kaplan. The subtitle is The Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power. It's one of the best books I've read. It's about 10 years old now, but essentially the Indian Ocean is also, to me, a bit like the Wild West. If you go all the way from, the Horn of Africa over to Burma to Bangladesh, I mean, it's a basket case India's surrounded by. And getting back to Japan and oil, I mean, everything, Japan only survives by getting oil through the Middle East, through India, through the Malacca Strait. It's a really great book. Highly encourage it, and really opened up my eyes to the Indian Ocean. And we may be spending more time in that part of the world. Let's go to our next topic. Are you guys ready for the next topic?
Sure.
Shoot.
We're going to talk about elections generally, and there's been a big realignment. I want to talk about what's happening in France with the left coalescing. If you guys want to dabble in the UK local elections, and then I want to talk about the US primaries. Just generally getting back to the idea, I think we're seeing obviously we're seeing a realignment. I don't know exactly what's happening. We have some classic big parties in these big democracies, but the constituents, the people that make up these parties, I think is shifting in a fundamentally tremendous way that we haven't seen before. And the impact is going to be quite revolutionary, I think, over the next 10, 15 years.
I think when we had Helen Thomas on 2 or 3 editions ago talking about the elections. I think all of us, and she certainly called it right for Macron. But the interesting thing was, would the left and the socialists, who pretty much imploded over the last 10 years, get back on the scene? And now Monsieur Mélenchon seems to be putting together a sort of coalition of everything from communists, socialists, and the Green Party. There could be a serious challenge in the parliamentary elections that come up in France. I'm going to test me on the date, but it's in a couple of months' time, I believe. And we may have that old situation of great French word, cohabitation, which means different things to different French people, but essentially is where you have the president and the parliament are from different parties. And history has shown that that is not good for France. Things tend to go around in circles and everybody blames everything else. So that could be a big factor in the summer for Europe in general, I think.
I think with Emmanuel Macron absolutely hell-bent to assume Angela Merkel's mantle as the leader of Europe, which I think he'll be incredibly reluctant to pull back on, because it looks like the German chancellor is not probably the strongest man that we've ever seen, because he's in let's face it, he inherited a hospital pass with that gas deal with Russia, and his hands are tied behind his back, and he's in two half Nelsons, and very little he can actually do.
Hey, David, I think the hospital pass, for our American audience, you may need to explain that. I think I may have caught your drift, but the hospital pass.
Hospital pass is, it doesn't matter if it's a quarterback throwing the ball out to the wide end, and collecting it, three guys with it at the same time. It's normally associated with what you guys call soccer over here.
Right.
Somebody sprays out a loose pass when he collects some gleaming studs shining in the sunshine at the same time as the ball. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt your train of thought. No, that was good.
Right. No. Gerald, carry on. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we covered Herr Scholz, the German chancellor, a little bit a couple of editions ago, and I think the general view was that he was in essentially ahead of quite a weak coalition, because it's everything from sort of very free market entrepreneurial wing right the way through to very left wing, the Green Party in Germany, and so he's kind of trying to stride 3 or 4 different horses that are not necessarily running in the same direction. David, you're right. The usual English bête noire of Monsieur Macron, we all now see him, is he going to be president of Europe or king of Europe or emperor or whatever he wants to be? And I think he sees his opportunity for that role. But funnily enough, if the parliamentary elections don't go well in France later in the summer, he might be in a difficult situation, none of which spells deep joy for the EU in particular at the moment, I think.
But would France benefit from, and this is totally biased, I recognize up front, I live and work in a 2-party system, but would France benefit from 2 solid parties as opposed to, this mix up of 10, 15 different parties? Would it strengthen the system? Would it push, is competition good though? Is this solidifying of the left? Will it help Macron? Is it good for France?
I don't know.
I don't think so. The reason I think that he's belting down the wrong road, I think one of the things, Mark and Gerald, that has been crystallized in the last 3 months is the Ukraine war. And this has shown serious gaps in Europeans' commitment to the cause, because they've got so many things. We've got Germany, we've got France, we've got Italy, unhappy with what's happening and various things that they need to suit for themselves. They're not united in their cause. They may say they are, but they haven't put their money where their mouth is as regards helping the Ukraine situation as well as they possibly could have. Then you've got what I would describe as the Eastern European countries, like Poland's now getting very nervous about being members of the European Union, not certain about Hungary, less than certain about Bulgaria. We've got, I think Europe's got the biggest problem in terms of its identification it's had since the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952 I think Europe is horribly split.
Well, that is interesting because it's shocking, but we're only 10 weeks into this Ukraine crisis. Well, I mean, 8 years and 10 weeks. I mean, I guess the most kinetic activities happened in the last 10 weeks. And how long is that going to last? I was reading some stuff today. The Americans, we're pouring tons of military weapons in there, tons of resources. Are the Europeans going to want to go on with that much longer? I mean, it's surprising that there hasn't been more talk for a truce and more pressure. And can the European juggernaut remain united around Ukraine with American leadership?
I'm reminded of the old saying that the speed of the convoy is the slowest ship. And one of the problems you have with the EU is that to get everybody on board, even not even the 28, just to get to say the top 10 on board is extremely difficult. And it means that they always are slightly on the back foot in terms of timing and the impact of what they're going to do. So to be honest, if I was Ukraine, I wouldn't be holding my breath on too much meaningful support from anybody other than probably the US, Canada, UK, and funnily enough, places like Japan and Australia, who I think will pitch in.
Getting back to the politics, and obviously there was a local election in the UK, and the primary season is very hot and heavy, and we have a midterm election here in the US in November. But it does seem that Biden, Johnson, and Macron have all benefited from Ukraine, certainly in the short term. And if you're suggesting that this is going to peter out, I mean, how does this impact these three leaders, or does it? Or are they just day traders? Are they just all day trading anyways?
Wasn't it the old Victorian nursery rhyme of best to hang on to nurse instead of something quite worse? And so the incumbents always get a boost when there's an external threat or danger. I think that's kind of standard practice. There's plenty of history for changing, leaders of countries and heads of state during wars. I mean, most famously, the UK got rid of Chamberlain after about a year of the Second World War. So Boris has been going around saying, well, don't rock the boat because, we can't make changes now and I'm the best person anyhow. The whole thing, I think, in the UK has kind of meandered into all sorts of ludicrous sort of scandals and celebrity nonsense in a way. The latest one is now whether or not the opposition leader has been caught having a curry and a couple of beers. This, in the scheme of things, is parish pump sort of gossip. But my bet is Macron will try to be as strong as he can be. Boris will cling on. He's quite a character for just persistently staying. I don't think he's going to be frank, people who want to get rid of him, I think, might be disappointed. I don't think it'd be that easy to get rid of him. Biden, I always hesitate to comment on US politics, but we did talk about Ohio last time, Mark, and J.D. Vance came out of the woodwork in the conversation and did well won the primary. So is that important or not important?
No, I think the Ohio primary, is very important. I think we have this Ivy League populism. J.D. Vance, Yale law degree. He's a venture capitalist. His wife's highly accomplished. I mean, just blue chip, white shoe all the way. And, both him and Trump are running around talking about blue collar issues. And I think getting back to this idea of the mixing and matching, the red wall, what we're seeing in Northern England, it does seem like highly educated people with multiple degrees, aspirational, have kind of moved to kind of left-wing parties, and we're seeing a more blue-collar emphasis on the right. But we have this grievance. You look at Ohio, they're pissed off about globalization, whereas in Florida, the Republicans down there are pissed off about wokeism. And it's just this weird coalition of two competing. It's all economic based. People are like, don't tread on me, right? Don't be woke. And then you have people like, give me protection in Ohio. And I think that's like the modern day politics. And the Democrats here in the States, and maybe Labor has done the same, they haven't figured out a way to capitalize on this. But I think we're in for a really interesting change of the political parties and the makeup. I mean, I think we're going to have them, but I think the people that vote in the main parties are going to be changing.
Can I just make one final comment on Macron?
Sure.
I think the lots of talk and do nothing attitude that Macron has done will please the French people, because the French people notoriously over the last 25 years have never wanted to get involved in any kind of military confrontation. And, you know, I think even though it may irritate us, irritate the United States, and irritate Ukraine as well, France is a peacemaker with this ridiculous pass the chunky marmalade table that they sit at, where he chucks the marmalade down and rolls it down the table. It's just ludicrous. And he's not kidding anybody that Putin is not going to give in to him. And I actually think that the fact that he's seen as the peacemaker, that's his role in Europe. French people will say, thank God he's not spending money that we haven't got on extra military stuff or anything else. To be honest with you, he's not my bag. He doesn't float my boat, but I think he's playing a blinder.
The money thing is quite interesting. I mean, Biden is running around trying to get another $33 billion to Ukraine, which I'm a total globalist, I'm all for America being all over the place, but I'm quite amazed that the amount of money the U.S. is throwing just after Afghanistan. I don't know. It's a very interesting time. I want to remind you guys, I don't know if you celebrated this week, May 2nd, 1997, Tony Blair was elected 25 years ago as prime minister. And I saw him speak this week. And, did he peak too early? Should he be prime minister now? I mean, or has anything changed? Or has nothing changed?
Well, whilst we're on key dates in May, what about May the 4th, 1979, when Margaret...
Oh, here we go.
Tony is a busted flush. And there's not been anybody sufficiently the sort of memento mori to, tap him on the shoulder and say, he's not in the political mainstream anymore. He's a significant figure, and obviously, and I don't think he has much of a constituency in the UK these days. And I can't imagine what sort of device there would be in UK politics for him to seriously reappear.
Not now.
Not now.
I mean, the thing is, apart from weapons of mass destruction and the joint effort with George W. Bush to go into Iraq, he would be a hero, because he is easily, since Margaret Thatcher, the most charismatic leader this country's had. I mean, he won 3 general elections by a landslide, and he put the United Kingdom in the center ground. He doesn't speak for me, but that doesn't matter. He spoke for the large majority of the country. And I think he did a very, very good job, but I'm afraid his reputation is in tatters over weapons of mass destruction, which were clearly not there.
I think one other theme, which maybe it's true of all politicians, I think famously Enoch Powell said that all political careers end in failure, is that when you look back at all, pretty much all the prime ministers still alive, they've all taken a hit with their reputations, whether it's John Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, the ill-fated Mrs. May, and Lord knows where Boris is going to come out in this pantheon, though I think Mark and I are pretty convinced he's going to have a long-running show in Las Vegas at some stage, which is his natural end game, I think.
Well, if you guys haven't read Tom Bauer's book, The Gambler, which is the story of his life, I recommend it to you. He hasn't got a kind thing to say about any one of the Johnson family, with the exception of Joe, and slightly less disparaging towards Rachel. It is a guinea a minute as a book. And if you've got time, it's one for the beach, if you know what I mean. But I just couldn't stop chortling throughout the whole thing.
I love it. No, watching Blair this week, even Obama made a big speech on disinformation at Stanford recently. In some ways, I was thinking, like, these guys, these prime ministers, Theresa May and whatnot, they should be prime minister for like 2 years, leave, right? Almost like a Steve Jobs situation, and come back to the job. It seems like, Blair and Obama they would better understand the job, right, of running these huge economies now than when they were in the office. I was thinking about like Steve Jobs going back to Apple. Why don't we bring these people back after they've had some time to think and reflect and learn something? It's an interesting system we have.
we've plenty of precedents for that in the UK. I mean, Gladstone did it 4 times. Churchill came back. Harold Wilson came back in the 60s and 70s. But I do think for Blair that ship has sailed. I'm not absolutely certain what his role is in life, though. He does seem to be doing awfully well in property speculation.
Well, I think he was. I mean, what better life? Run around speaking with fine people like you. I mean, this is what I want to do. All right, let's talk about. We're going to go back to the EU and NATO, namely EU sanctions and also NATO expansion. We're on the cusp of NATO expanding to Sweden and Finland. EU sanctions. What is happening?
This is surprising, isn't it? Because let's just recall that Sweden was neutral during the Second World War. They were in a very tight corner there because they were major suppliers of iron ore, and Germany was one of their customers. But they managed to kind of stay out of the actual fighting, and they've always been a sort of politically a deeply neutral country. And the idea that they may jump into bed with NATO would have been, I would have thought, unthinkable 5 or 10 years ago. Finland's slightly different in that obviously the Winter War in the early 1940s, where we had Russia invade Finland, and the Finns did well, but they gave up quite a bit of ground. And since then, Finland's had a very sort of on-off relationship with the Russians. So the idea, again, that they're happy to upset the Russians, I guess, and want to join NATO is a big change. I think it looks like it's going to happen, actually. What do you think, David?
I have to say I'd be very concerned. I consider it at the current moment quite a dangerous move. I think one of the things that Putin has been wailing about, and it's his own fault, is the fact that the number of weapons that are being gathered together near Russia, going through whether it's Poland, Hungary, and various other places, all the way engulfing him, made him feel, for no reason at all, somewhat uncomfortable. And I think the situation is that Finland and particularly Sweden were to do that, I think it would exacerbate the problem at this given moment in time. Mark, you very rightly pointed out that it does look like NATO and the European Union are going to cozy up. I think they need to be extremely careful how they cozy up, because I think Putin is both, how can I put it, evil and mad, and would not require too much titillating, for want of a better expression, to do something that we in the rest of the world might regret terribly. I'm not a person who's frightened, and I actually think with nuclear war, once somebody pulls the trigger, it's the end of the world, because everybody retaliates. But he is stupid enough to try something that might be very regrettable. And I just think that those people that are currently involved, in the conflict, NATO is, I think, been very well led by Stoltenberg. I think he's done a very good job. I think there's a lot of strength, a lot of power there. But to sort of actually aggravate the situation, I just think the timing of it wouldn't be sensible.
Well, since June, I just read this op-ed, which I'll post, from Azran Barzani, and I wasn't aware of this, but Hawaii, which is a U.S. state, as you recall, is not guaranteed protection under NATO, which was part of the original agreement. So it's literally only the North Atlantic. But of course, now we've expanded NATO to Asia with Turkey. It would seem to me, if you're going to add Sweden and Finland, that you might as well limp on the Pacific Ocean. Any territory that NATO countries have in the Pacific should get lumped in as well. I mean, it seems if you're going to expand this thing, you should really expand it. It shouldn't just be limited to Europe, because not only is this going to agitate Russia, but the Chinese, like I said, since June 2021, NATO has put China on the radar as a problem. It seems to me if you're going to go big, right? Why limit it just to Europe? If you're going to agitate one person, you might as well agitate two and expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
There's another factor which I think you mentioned on a previous occasion, Mark, was the Chinese maneuvers in the small Pacific Islands, and the one that's got everybody's attention is the Solomon Islands, where the Solomon Islands government have seemed to have invited the Chinese in to give defense advice, which is always a lovely acronym, or not acronym, I mean metaphor for what may be going on. And that, again, maybe seeing things through a very sort of Western view of things is quite shocking. You know, we don't associate China with that sort of move into the Pacific Islands, and I would think that it's got the Australians very agitated. So whether we're going to end up with big global strategic military blocks on both sides, who knows? But that looks to be the way of travel. As to Hawaii, I was staggered by that fact, actually, Mark.
Yeah, me too.
You could be on holiday. You could be on holiday on Waikiki Beach, and you're on your own.
I know. I was
like it.
Yeah, I was unaware myself. I was actually, I was in the same boat. I think, no pun intended. What's interesting about the Pacific as well, you mentioned the Chinese going to the Solomon Islands. The U.S. reportedly has about 800 military bases around the world. This would only be the Chinese second military base anywhere in the world. You know, China is a permanent member of the UN, permanent member. It's a great power by any stretch. So to think that they might have two bases seems extreme. But, you know, the amount of ink that we spilled and written about this seems quite unproportional. I mean, should we be surprised that China would want other military bases and think a way to kind of expand their influence around the world?
Well, here's the dilemma for China. They're the rising economic power, and what goes with that is a rising military power. But as we were discussing a little earlier, on a 25, 50-year basis, they may be a declining economic power. So all the narrative of the last 25 years has been the rise and rise and rise of China, but will it be sustainable? And that's the great unknown, really. And well, we're just going to have to stick around for 50 years to see, I guess.
That's very big footprints in Africa and starting to do so in South America now. So how can I put it? Their aspirations are far from dead, if you know what I mean.
Mm. Yeah, but one of my favorite sayings is, you know, aspirational is not the same as operational, right? Like, you know, no, I have aspirations to do a lot of things, but I've not operationally been able to achieve them. David, getting back to Europe and the EU, what is the end game here? I mean, NATO expansion, EU sanctions. Is there a desire, privately or quietly, that they just hope that they can put enough pressure on Moscow that they'll find a way to get rid of Putin at the end of the day, and we can all get back to business as usual?
Well, I think the media situation is unbelievably frustrating. The fact that the real tale is failing to get through, even using Instagram and Facebook and the rest of it is just not happening. And the only reasons that something that Gerald and I discussed earlier last week and frustrated me beyond belief, not with him, but I mean, is this business of sanctions, and they are not working. We've seen, I mean, I've spoke to a friend of mine who had friends returning from Russia 2 weeks ago. Shops are full of vegetables, full of food. There's nothing problem. All right, there's no luxuries there from, you know, any of the Italian or French shops or the UK shops. So what? They're filling their bellies. They haven't got any shortage of oil. They're driving around in their cars. There's no change at all for them. We know that it is eventually going to damage their economy. But until we get some help from India, until SWIFT on its own as regards to financial payments isn't good enough, we need other areas to stop the money getting through. And for the European, for Ursula von der Leyen to turn around on Thursday, whenever it was, saying we're doing our best to stop the import of oil and gas, or not gas, but oil, by the end of the year. Do me a favor. I mean, we need it done yesterday. I mean, what a ludicrous statement is that? United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia couldn't care less, do a lot of business with Russia. That's very irritating for me and for a lot of other people around the world. This is like a sieve, the sanctions. It isn't working.
And it seems like we're only penalizing ourselves. Just this week, you know, BP took a $25 billion charge after 3 decades of investment. Now they got to find a Chinese or Saudi Arabian buyer to sell these assets. You know, McDonald's, we talk about, same thing. You know, they've been there for decades, and they suddenly got to walk away from all these assets, all these investments, with no roadmap on how to go back. Some of these sanctions clearly have not been well thought out, and there's no guidepost to say, hey, okay, now it's time we can go back to Russia, start doing business. I think we're in for a very dicey situation, definitely in the short term, but this to me is like a decade-long problem we're looking at.
Yeah, I would agree. And we're not exactly cheering our listeners and viewers up today, really.
Well,
We haven't done a great job, have we?
It's rather a dystopian sort of message.
Well, let's change that. Let's finish with our favorite segment, what we're reading and watching, which I know from all the viewer mail we get, that's their favorite segment. They love our cultural insights. David, by tradition, we usually let the special guest go first, but if you want to pass, we can come back to you.
No, I might make you all laugh and maybe maintain the tone. I have, in the past week, seen the two worst films I've seen for 10 years. One was called Operation Mincemeat, which is a war story.
Oh, good. Dissension. This is great. This is Gerald's record. This is Gerald. No, hold on. This was Gerald's recommendation last. This was Gerald's recommendation last show. This is great. We have Dissension.
I quite enjoyed that, David, though I can see why you didn't like it, because it had that sort of romantic theme in it, which is nothing really to do with the actual story.
No, I know they say it's Hollywood and everything else, but no, it was shot. But the worst was Downton Abbey. Oh my God. Julian Fellowes, what on earth he was doing. This was the shocker. This is the turkey to beat all turkeys.
It's the Heaven's Gate of the 2020s, is it?
Yeah. And on the reading matter, let me say there is a book written by a gentleman called Jeffrey Robertson, QC. He is a very left-wing human rights lawyer, outstanding intellect. I disagree with everything he says on any subject. In his chambers, he had, now this is a bit parochial, Mark, for which you'll have to forgive me, but it might bring a wry smile from Gerald. He had Helena Kennedy, Keir Starmer, and a fellow called Jolyon Morn, all of which, but it is, I got so angry reading this book, I couldn't put it down. It was absolutely wonderful. And he hasn't a single friend on the right-hand side of the page, politically, apart from John Morton, who's been dead for 25 years. If you want to laugh, and the guy, in fairness, has saved the lives of hundreds of people from the hangman. But apart from that, he is, to me, the epitome of everything I don't stand for, but a wonderful read.
Well, I guess
it's called Rather His Own Man.
Well, I guess that's a recommendation. I can't top that. I normally go next, and Mark and tidies everything up and brings things back to sanity. A book which I bought a long time ago, back in the 80s, The Hebridean Connection by Derrick Cooper. And the reason I hooked it out was I went on a quick sort of 7 or 8 day tour of the Highlands and Islands last week. Now, Derrick Cooper, if you're a certain vintage in the UK, maybe a familiar name. He had a very sort of grand voiceover career. He was the rather wonderful voice for Tomorrow's World, which was a science program in the 80s and 90s. So if you look him up on YouTube, certainly British viewers would recognize his voice almost straight away. He was, of course, a journalist as well. And the theme of this book is the fact that, and I'm a good example of it last week, people go off to Skye and Mull and all these other islands, and they go in the summertime, and they think how wonderful it is, and they have a slightly romanticized view of what it's like. And like a lot of these places, you need to go there in January, February to get a slightly more nuanced view of the sheer struggle of living in some of these places. So, as I say, Hebridean Connection, he had family from Skye, and it's very interesting. As to viewing, I haven't been viewing anything other than lots of mountains and lochs and all the rest of it in Skye. My first visit, I recommend it to anybody. It is the most wonderful place, I think, in terms of scenery and all the rest of it. The locals are very friendly. They have quite a funny expression for people who turn up and think they'd like to live there. They call them the white settlers, on the basis that they normally spend about 6 months there and then go back to, warmer parts of Britain. And a final thing, not that I think he will be a viewer, but maybe this will make him famous. A shout out to a taxi driver called Graham Smith, who was probably the world's greatest raconteur I've ever come across. Better than even you, David. He was an extraordinarily witty and amusing man. Anybody going there, Graham Smith at Kyle Cabs is the man you need to have in Skye. So there we are.
Lovely.
Absolutely fantastic. On my dad's side, my grandfather was born in Scotland, and we've got connections to Inverness and Tain and Glasgow. So I'm second generation, huge fan of Scotland. Desperate to make it to Skye myself. So yeah, I think visiting off season is the best time to go. I don't know. There's nothing better than.
There's a sweet spot. We've got if you go in high summer, it's the dreaded Highland midges. And if you go any time between October and March, expect it to be very windy, very wet, and very dark. So you've got to kind of pick your moment, really.
Actually sounds delightful. Sounds like a perfect time to go. Well, I'm going to talk about, I went to the Bloomberg Green Summit last week up in New York City, which was fantastic. One of the, I guess, second business trip I've been on. I actually got on the train, was out and about. It was great to be back in New York City, back in Manhattan. The Bloomberg Green Summit was quite interesting. A lot of sustainability, a lot of energy. I've been focusing on this space for various reasons. A lot of huge commitments. I don't know if you guys saw John Doerr with the venture capitalists just made a huge donation to Stanford University. Yeah. And really talking about how technology is going to solve this. And I think the speakers I had there were quite interesting. There was an architect there, William McDonough, who was quite positive. And, so much of the climate debate and energy is just dour and negative. And I don't know. I'm a big believer in technology to solve these problems. And clearly we need energy to live a modern life. And, we got to find a better way to embrace it. But one of the lectures was at the Polo Store. And a book I've been noodling on, I haven't started to read it yet, but it's about fast fashion by Dana Thomas, who's a reporter with the New York Times, and just the price of fast fashion. I think, cars and airplanes get a lot of attention around the energy debate, but the way we, make clothing, especially this fast fashion, is quite detrimental. And I think, having a new approach to, what we do with clothing, think about the great sheep farmers up in Scotland. If you buy yourself a classic Scotland Highland sweater, that thing will last you 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe even 50 years. I mean, I think we have to have a new approach. So I'm kind of digging into that fast fashion. And obviously I'm a very fashionable person, so this makes total sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of comes to your, a thing we haven't done enough on yet, which is the circular economy. There's far too much of fashion is just disposable. And we need a less disposable world, don't we? And so anything that, as you say, from a technological point of view, that can improve that has got to be a good thing, I think. The
problem is that if you think about it, sartorial elegance is out the window. It's sneakers, bobby socks, and shorts, isn't it? And some designer stubble, and that's it. I mean, it's unbelievable the way people dress in London now. Even more formal people. I mean, the idea of somebody actually owning a suit or, something that's going to be lasting for some time I'm going to think it's almost heresy to talk about it.
Well, I'm optimistic the tie will come back in my lifetime.
I've got about 75 of them, so I hope you're right, Mark.
I would say if you want to stand out and differentiate, stick on a suit and tie. All the hipsters look wildly old-fashioned with their beards and all the rest of it now. Get a suit, get a tie, and get ahead, maybe.
I love it. That's good advice. I like what would James Bond do? He would probably wear a suit and a tie. So that's probably good advice. David, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you'll come back.
It's been a huge pleasure, Mark. Lovely to meet you, and thank you for your courtesy and kindness. And the same to you, Gerald. Bless you, and see you soon.
I want to say hi to our friends in RAI Italia. We're trying to get a contract in Rome. So if you know anybody in the Rome bureau, David, we're happy to lump you into our multi-series deal.
Thank you.
It will happen. We believe it will happen. So
we're going to manifest it. We're going to manifest it like all the youth, the millennials. We're going to manifest it. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.